100,000 years ago, when the sun went down, the most dangerous hour of a human life began. Not hunger, not cold, the night. In the darkness hunted creatures that could see 10 times better than we could, that moved without a sound, that could crush a skull with a single bite. We had no fangs, no claws, not even particularly good night vision. And yet we survived. Not because we defeated the darkness, because we figured out how to live inside it. Before we go any further, please subscribe to this channel. Your support genuinely helps us keep making films like this one. Thank you. Now, let's talk about the dark. Try for a moment to imagine real darkness. Not the darkness of your bedroom at night, with a phone screen glowing somewhere on a nightstand, with a streetlight leaking through the blinds, with the faint electric hum of a refrigerator 2 rooms away. Real darkness. The kind that existed on this planet for the overwhelming majority of the time our species has walked it. A darkness so complete that you could hold your hand an inch from your face and see nothing. A darkness in which the only light came from the moon when it chose to show itself, and from stars whose brightness modern humans, living under the permanent orange haze of artificial light, have almost entirely forgotten how to see. This was the world for roughly 95% of the time that anatomically modern humans have existed. Electric light is, in evolutionary terms, an event that happened 5 minutes ago. Before that, darkness, every single night, for every single person who ever lived. And that darkness was not neutral. It was not simply an absence of light, a blank canvas, a period of rest between productive days. For most of human history, nightfall was the moment when the odds of survival tilted sharply against you. Consider the animal you actually are, biologically speaking, stripped of every tool, every weapon, every advantage that culture and technology have given you. A relatively slow, relatively weak, thin-skinned primate, walking upright on 2 legs, with blunt fingernails instead of claws, with teeth built for grinding plants rather than tearing flesh. Our daytime vision is excellent. Among primates, among mammals generally, human color vision and visual acuity in bright light are genuinely remarkable. But strip away the light and something strange happens. Our eyes, so capable during the day, become almost useless. Human night vision is mediocre at best. We lack the reflective layer behind the retina, the tapetum lucidum, that gives cats, deer, and countless other mammals their eerie, glowing eyes, and their extraordinary ability to gather what little light exists in darkness and use it twice. We lack it entirely. In true darkness, a human being is, for all practical purposes, blind. Now place that half-blind, clawless, fangless primate on the plains and in the forests of Pleistocene Africa, and then populate the surrounding darkness with animals that evolved over tens of millions of years to be specialists in exactly the environment where we were weakest. The lion did not need daylight. The leopard actively preferred the absence of it. The hyena with a bite force exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch, enough, quite literally, to crush the long bones and skull of a human being as easily as you might crack open a walnut. Hunted with particular confidence after dark, when its extraordinary sense of smell and its ability to see in near total blackness gave it every advantage over prey that could barely make out shapes 10 feet away. These were not abstract dangers. These were not campfire stories invented to keep children close. The fossil record contains the evidence, written directly onto bone. There is a specific piece of evidence that deserves to be examined in more detail before we move further, because it does something rare in paleoanthropology. It identifies not just that a predator killed a human ancestor, but which predator and precisely how. At a site in South Africa called Swartkrans, researchers examining a fossilized skull belonging to an early hominin, likely Paranthropus robustus, a heavily built relative that shared the landscape with our own direct ancestors roughly 1 to 2 million years ago, noticed 2 puncture marks in the cranium, positioned close together near the top of the skull. For years, the marks puzzled researchers. They were too widely spaced and too deep to have been made by a stone tool. They were too precisely placed, too symmetrical to be the result of some accidental geological process. Eventually, a comparison was made against the skull of a modern leopard, and the match was exact. The distance between the 2 puncture marks corresponded precisely to the distance between a leopard's lower canine teeth. The angle and depth of penetration matched the specific mechanics of a leopard's killing bite, a bite typically delivered to the base of the skull or the back of the neck, designed to sever the spinal cord with maximum efficiency and minimum risk to the predator itself. What the evidence suggests, with a clarity that is almost uncomfortable to sit with, is a very specific kind of death. Leopards are, among the African big cats, unusually specialized as ambush predators of primates. Unlike lions, which typically hunt in open cooperative groups and prefer large herd animals, leopards often hunt alone, and they show a documented preference in certain regions for climbing into trees at night and dropping onto prey below, or stalking silently along forest margins where visibility is poor and escape routes are limited. Modern leopards in parts of Africa are still known, on rare but well-documented occasions, to specifically target humans. And when they do, the strike pattern typically mirrors exactly what the Swartkrans skull preserves. A swift, silent approach from above or behind, a single decisive bite to the head or neck, and a kill executed so quickly that the victim often has no opportunity to cry out or fight back. This is worth dwelling on because it changes the emotional texture of what we're describing. We are not talking about a chaotic battle, 2 creatures locked in a desperate struggle beneath the stars. We are talking about something closer to an execution, silent, efficient, over before it began. For an animal like the leopard, perfectly adapted to low-light hunting, a hominin walking or sleeping in the open after dark was not a formidable opponent to be worn down through struggle. It was simply an opportunity, no more dangerous to approach than any other prey species, that lacked the sensory equipment to detect the threat until it was already too late. and leopards were not rare. Fossil and modern distribution data both indicate that leopards, or their close ancestral relatives, occupied nearly the entire range across which early hominins evolved and dispersed: Sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, the Middle East, South and Southeast Asia. There was, for the overwhelming majority of our evolutionary history, almost nowhere on the continent of our origin where a hominin population could reasonably expect to be entirely free of leopard predation risk. The threat was not occasional. It was, in a functional sense, ambient, a constant background probability, higher after dark, that needed to be managed every single night, for hundreds of thousands of years, by every single group of our ancestors who wanted to see morning. Now consider what this meant, practically, for the earliest hominins, species like Australopithecus and early Homo, living before the mastery of fire, before sophisticated weapons, before the kind of large, coordinated social groups that later provided collective protection. What options did they actually have? The most likely answer, and one supported by comparative behavioral research on modern chimpanzees and other primates that share overlapping predator threats, is that they retreated upward. Trees. For a species transitioning toward a more fully bipedal, ground-dwelling existence, the ability to climb into the branches of a tall tree at dusk and remain there until dawn would have offered one of the only reliable defenses against ground-based nocturnal predators like lions and hyenas. Though notably, it offered considerably less protection against leopards, which are themselves accomplished climbers and are well known, even today, for dragging prey carcasses up into tree branches specifically to keep them safe from scavenging hyenas below. This detail matters because it means that even the most obvious nighttime survival strategy available to early hominins, get off the ground, was only a partial solution, effective against some threats while leaving the door open to others. This is the accumulated weight of evolutionary pressure we need to hold in mind as we move forward into the story of fire and social sleep. Not a single dramatic threat that technology eventually solved in one triumphant stroke, but a dense, overlapping multi-species web of nighttime danger, each predator specialized in exploiting a slightly different weakness in early hominin defenses, none of them fully neutralized by any single behavioral adaptation on its own. In Morocco, at a site called Thomas Quarry, researchers examining a human ancestor's fossilized thigh bone, dated to approximately 500,000 years old, found something specific and unambiguous: tooth marks. Not cut marks made by a stone tool, which would indicate that humans were butchering an animal. Tooth marks, the kind left by a predator's jaws closing around bone and dragging flesh from it. The pattern matched, with considerable precision, the bite characteristics of an ancient hyena species. Whether that particular individual was killed by the hyena or simply scavenged after death by some other cause remains scientifically uncertain. The bone alone cannot settle that question definitively. But what it proves beyond any doubt is this: at least 500,000 years ago, in at least one documented case, the body of a human ancestor became food for a large carnivore. We were not always, and not everywhere, the apex predator we like to imagine ourselves as having always been. Sometimes we were simply meat, and the danger did not diminish as brains grew larger and tools grew sharper. If anything, the archaeological record of predator-human interaction becomes richer, more detailed, and more dramatic as we move closer to our own species. At a cave site in Germany called Siegsdorf, researchers examined the skeleton of a cave lion, an animal up to 25% larger than the modern African lion, some individuals stretching nearly 12 feet from nose to tail and weighing more than 700 pounds, and found a very specific kind of damage. A puncture wound to a rib, its shape and depth consistent with a single precisely placed thrust from a wooden spear. The lion was approximately 48,000 years old. The wound was almost certainly delivered by a Neanderthal. Sit with that for a moment, because it tells you two things simultaneously, and they are in direct tension with each other. It tells you that Neanderthals, dismissed for so long in popular imagination as brutish and unsophisticated, were capable of killing the single most dangerous predator in their environment, a killing that required not just courage, but extraordinary tactical precision. Get close enough to a 700-pound apex predator to deliver a single fatal thrust to a vital organ and somehow survive the attempt. That is not luck. That is skill, developed over the accumulated experience of a species that had been living alongside these animals for hundreds of thousands of years. And it tells you something else, something that we tend to forget in an age when we control our environment so completely that we've forgotten what it costs to control it. The fact that killing a cave lion was remarkable enough to leave a permanent mark on the fossil record tells you that most encounters between our ancestors and apex predators did not end this way. Most of the time, the predator was in control. Most of the time, humans were the ones running, hiding, climbing, praying to whatever they believed governed the world that they would make it back to camp. This is the world our ancestors' nervous systems were built for. And this is where we need to talk about something that lives inside your skull right now. Something you inherited. Something that has been quietly running in the background of your mind for your entire life without your explicit awareness of it. Deep in the temporal lobe of your brain, on both sides, sit two small almond-shaped clusters of neurons called the amygdalae. The name comes from the Greek word for almond, because that is roughly the shape and size of these structures, small enough to hold between two fingers, and yet responsible for something enormous. The processing of fear, the rapid, pre-conscious evaluation of threat, the decision, made in a fraction of a second, faster than your conscious mind can weigh in, of whether the shape in the shadows is a threat worth fleeing from immediately before you've even had time to think the word threat. The amygdala does not care about your modern context. It does not know that you live in a house with a locked door and a working alarm system, in a city with no lions, no hyenas, no leopards prowling the darkness outside your window. It evolved in an environment where an unexplained sound in the dark, more often than any of us are comfortable admitting, meant something was actually there, and that whatever it was might be capable of killing you. The genetic and neurological architecture that produces the specific, universal, cross-cultural experience of nighttime fear. The tightening in your chest when you wake at 3 in the morning to an unfamiliar creak. The reluctance, even as a grown adult, to walk into a dark basement without first finding the light switch. This architecture was not designed by evolution to make you irrational. It was designed to make you alive long enough to reproduce, in a world where night was, statistically, considerably more dangerous than day. This is the baseline. This is the starting condition. A biologically unimpressive primate, poorly equipped for darkness in almost every respect that matters, sharing a landscape with multiple species of large, efficient, nocturnally adapted predators, carrying in its very neurology a hardwired alarm system calibrated to a threat level that, for most of our species' history, was entirely justified. And then, something changed everything. Roughly 1 million years ago, the dating remains actively debated among researchers, with some evidence pushing controlled fire use back further, and other evidence suggesting later, more consistent adoption. Early humans in what is now South Africa, at a site called Wonderwerk Cave, began doing something that no other animal on Earth had ever managed to do with any reliability. They were not simply encountering fire, the way countless animals have encountered fire caused by lightning strikes or volcanic activity throughout the history of life on this planet. They were keeping it, tending it, feeding it fuel to prevent it from dying, and, this is the crucial, world-altering detail, carrying its embers forward from one need to the next, so that a fire lit once did not have to be lit again from nothing. It is difficult, from where we sit today, surrounded by light switches and matches and lighters that produce flame with the press of a single button, to fully appreciate what an extraordinary technological and cognitive achievement this represented. Fire is not a passive tool, like a sharpened stone that simply sits there until you pick it up and use it. Fire is alive, in a functional sense. It needs to be fed. It can be smothered. It can spread out of control and become as dangerous as anything it was meant to protect you from. It requires understanding of airflow and fuel and timing that goes well beyond what is needed to nap a hand axe. Successfully domesticating fire required a level of forward planning, of understanding cause and consequence over extended time, that represents one of the genuine cognitive leaps in the history of our lineage. And the first and most immediate consequence of that leap was this. For the first time in the history of any hominin species, night stopped being uniformly, universally dangerous. Think about what fire actually does to a predator's calculus. A lion's night vision, extraordinary as it is, depends on a completely dark environment to function at its best. The same reflective layer behind its eyes that lets it gather ambient starlight and moonlight into a usable image is overwhelmed and effectively blinded by direct, bright, flickering light. A fire at the mouth of a cave, or blazing at the center of an open campsite, did not just provide warmth and a place to cook. It created a bubble of relative safety, a zone in which the predator's primary sensory advantage, its ability to see in the dark far better than we could, was neutralized. The night was still dark beyond the firelight's reach. But within it, for the first time, our ancestors could see their surroundings, could see each other's faces, could see anything approaching before it got close enough to attack. But mastering fire was never as simple as striking a spark and calling the problem solved. The archaeological record makes clear that the relationship between early humans and controlled flame developed unevenly, with long stretches of opportunistic, inconsistent use before anything resembling reliable, on-demand fire-making emerged. The evidence from Wonderwork Cave, ash deposits, charred plant remains, and burned bone fragments dated to approximately 1 million years ago shows fire being used deep within the cave, in a location where a naturally occurring wildfire could not plausibly have spread on its own. This strongly suggests deliberate transport of burning material into the cave and its maintenance there. But evidence of this kind, this early, remains genuinely rare across the broader archaeological record. For a very long stretch afterward, hundreds of thousands of years, sites showing confirmed sustained fire use appear only sporadically, scattered thinly across the landscape and across time, suggesting that early hominin populations may have relied heavily on capturing and nursing along fires that originated naturally from lightning strikes or volcanic activity, rather than reliably generating flame from nothing whenever it was needed. The technology of fire generation itself, friction-based methods like the hand drill or the bow drill, or percussion methods striking flint against pyrite to throw a spark into tinder, required a level of technical sophistication and material knowledge that appears to have developed later and unevenly across different hominin populations. This distinction matters enormously for our story, because it means that, for a very long period, a group's access to fire on any given night may not have been guaranteed. A fire that went out during a storm, or that could not be adequately fed during a period of scarce fuel, might mean an unprotected night, a return, however temporary, to exactly the vulnerable darkness their ancestors had always faced. By the time we reach the Neanderthals, a species that has left us an unusually rich and well-preserved record of hearths across their European and Western Asian range, fire use appears considerably more consistent, though even here the picture is more complicated than early researchers assumed. Excavations at multiple Neanderthal sites reveal hearths of genuinely varied construction. Some simple surface fires with minimal preparation, others involving carefully arranged stone rings clearly intended to contain and direct the burn. Still others showing evidence of specific fuel selection, with certain wood types apparently preferred for their burning characteristics over others readily available in the immediate environment. This variation tells us something important, that fire management was not a single, simple skill acquired once and then applied identically forever, but an evolving, regionally adapted technology, refined generation after generation by trial, error, and accumulated practical knowledge passed down within each community. And the stakes of getting it right were not merely comfort. Richard Wrangham's cooking hypothesis, when examined closely, makes a claim considerably more radical than simply that cooked food tastes better or is easier to chew. His argument, grounded in comparative studies of energy expenditure across primate digestive systems, is that raw food diets, even nutrient-dense ones including meat, cannot easily supply enough usable, readily absorbed energy to support a brain of the size and metabolic cost that modern humans carry. Chimpanzees, close genetic relatives with diets rich in both plant material and occasional meat, spend a substantial portion of their daily active hours, often 5 hours or more, simply chewing, breaking down tough, fibrous, difficult-to-digest raw food into something their gut can process. Cooking performs a significant portion of that mechanical and chemical breakdown externally, using fire instead of teeth and stomach acid, gelatinizing starches, denaturing proteins, breaking down tough plant cell walls, effectively pre-digesting food before it ever reaches the body. The metabolic energy this frees up, energy that would otherwise be spent on hours of chewing and on the substantial digestive cost of processing raw, fibrous material, is, in Wrangham's model, precisely the kind of resource surplus that evolution could plausibly redirect toward growing and sustaining an increasingly expensive brain. It is a striking coincidence, if it is a coincidence at all, that the period during which controlled fire use appears to become more established in the hominin archaeological record overlaps meaningfully with a period of accelerating brain size increase in several Homo lineages. Correlation, in evolutionary biology, is never definitive proof of causation on its own. But the timing, combined with the clear mechanistic plausibility of the cooking hypothesis, has made it one of the more seriously considered explanations for one of the strangest and most consequential facts about our species: that we carry, relative to our body size, by far the most expensive brain of any mammal that has ever lived, and we appear to have paid for it, at least in significant part, with fire. But there's a second, less discussed consequence of fire that matters just as much for the story we're telling, and it has to do with time itself. Before fire, the length of a productive human day was set entirely by the sun. When the light failed, activity essentially had to stop, not because anyone decided to stop, but because there was, quite literally, nothing safe or useful to do in total darkness. You could not forage. You could not make tools with any precision. You could not travel any meaningful distance without significant risk of injury or predation. The night was empty time, dead time, time that had to simply be endured, ideally by being unconscious for as much of it as possible. Fire changed the length of the usable day, not by making the sun stay up longer, obviously, but by creating a second artificial period of safe lit activity that extended well past sunset. And this new block of time, this stretch of hours that had never before existed in the functional life of any hominin, needed to be filled with something. It could not simply be filled with the same tasks that occupied daylight hours, because those tasks, hunting, long-distance foraging, tool production requiring fine visual precision, were still constrained by what firelight could adequately illuminate. What firelight was extremely well suited for, on the other hand, was something else entirely: close-range social contact. Faces, visible in flickering orange light, close enough together to read expression and gesture. Voices, no longer competing with the ambient noise and activity of a working day. A group of people, seated or lying in a loose circle, with nothing pressing left to do except talk to one another. This is, according to a growing body of anthropological research, when something remarkable and easy to overlook began happening. The campfire became the first stage in human history, and what was performed on that stage was not random chatter. It was, specifically and disproportionately, stories. A striking piece of research conducted among the Jew/Wansi San people of the Kalahari Desert in southern Africa, one of the last populations on Earth to have maintained, until relatively recently, a way of life resembling the hunter-gatherer existence of our deep past, found a clear and consistent pattern when researchers compared the content of daytime conversation to nighttime conversation around the fire. Daytime talk, the study found, tended to be practical and often tinged with complaint. Economic matters, logistics, criticism, gossip about who had failed to share resources fairly, disputes needing resolution. Fire-lit conversation after dark was different in almost every measurable way. It shifted overwhelmingly towards storytelling, toward myths, toward songs, toward accounts of distant relatives and legendary events, toward content designed not to solve an immediate practical problem, but to transmit shared cultural knowledge, to build and reinforce social bonds, to entertain. There is something almost poetic in the idea that the technology which first protected us from nighttime predators also, quite directly, gave us the raw material, time, safety, close physical proximity, a captive and attentive audience, from which storytelling as a human universal likely emerged. The fire did not just keep the lions at bay. It built the stage on which the first fictions were told, the first myths were shaped, the first shared narratives that would eventually become religion, history, and eventually, though it would take many more tens of thousands of years, the medium you are experiencing this very sentence through right now. But fire, for all its transformative power, did not make the darkness beyond its glow any less dangerous. It shrank the threat. It did not eliminate it. And so, alongside the technological solution of flame, our ancestors developed a second, purely social and behavioral solution to the problem of the night, one that required no tools at all, only each other. The anthropologist David Sampson, who has spent thousands of hours directly observing the sleep behavior of both wild primates and modern hunter-gatherer societies, has proposed what he calls the social sleep hypothesis, and it addresses one of the strangest, most persistently puzzling facts about human sleep. We do it very differently from every other primate on Earth, and the differences make almost no sense unless you consider the specific danger our ancestors faced after dark. Consider the numbers. Most non-human primates, chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, sleep somewhere in the range of 10 to 12 hours per night, much of it in a relatively undifferentiated, moderate depth state. Modern hunter-gatherer populations without access to electricity, groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of the Kalahari, the Tsimane of Bolivia, studied specifically because their lifestyle offers the closest available approximation to the conditions our ancestors evolved under. Sleep, on average, somewhere between 5.7 and 7.1 hours per night. Not 10 hours, not 12. Roughly 6.5. This finding, published in landmark research led by Jerome Siegel and colleagues, initially surprised researchers who had assumed that pre-industrial, pre-electric populations would sleep considerably more than modern, artificially lit populations, simply because they had nothing else to do once darkness fell and no artificial light keeping them awake. The opposite turned out to be true. Hunter-gatherers sleep less than the average modern city dweller, with a phone glowing in their hand until midnight, not more. And it's not just the quantity that's strange, it's the quality, and specifically the proportion of sleep spent in a particular state. Rapid eye movement sleep, or REM, the stage in which the most vivid dreaming occurs, and, crucially, the stage in which the body's major muscle groups become temporarily paralyzed. A physiological safeguard that prevents us from physically acting out the content of our dreams. Human beings spend up to 25% of total sleep time in REM, the highest proportion of any primate studied. Orangutans, by comparison, spend a much smaller fraction of their sleep in this deeply vulnerable, muscularly paralyzed state. Here is where Sampson's hypothesis becomes genuinely elegant and a little unsettling once you sit with its implications. REM, sleep, precisely because it involves muscular paralysis, is the most physically vulnerable state a mammal can enter. An animal in REM, sleep, cannot leap up and flee at the first sign of danger, the way an animal in lighter, non-REM sleep can. For a solitary animal, or for an animal sleeping in a small, poorly defended group, spending a large proportion of the night in this deeply paralyzed state would be an extraordinarily risky evolutionary strategy. You are, for a meaningful stretch of every single night, essentially defenseless. Unless you are not sleeping alone. Unless you are sleeping in a large group in which, and this is the specific claim of the social sleep hypothesis, at least one member is likely to be awake or in a lighter stage of sleep at any given moment, functioning as a de facto sentry even without anyone formally being assigned to keep watch. Sampson has described the arrangement using a vivid image. He compares an ancestral hunter-gatherer camp to a snail's shell, something that can be picked up and carried, that moves with its inhabitants and provides a portable zone of collective protection. His research suggests that ancestral human camps likely consisted of somewhere between 15 and 20 individuals sleeping in reasonably close proximity around a central fire, with sleep timing naturally staggered across the group, some drifting off earlier, some later, some waking in the deep hours of the night for entirely mundane reasons, like an infant needing attention or simple insomnia, creating an overlapping, rotating pattern of vigilance across the group without anyone consciously organizing a watch schedule. Even more intriguing, Sampson's research found that chronotype, whether an individual is naturally inclined toward earlier or later sleep and wake times, appears to shift systematically across the human lifespan. Younger adults tend to stay up later and wake later. Older adults tend to go to sleep earlier and wake earlier. If you have ever wondered why your grandparents seem to rise at dawn without effort, while you or your children struggle to get out of bed before 9, there may be a genuinely ancient explanation embedded in that difference. A group composed of multiple generations, each with a naturally different sleep-wake schedule, produces a rolling, largely unconscious system of collective nighttime vigilance that would have been extraordinarily difficult to achieve through deliberate planning alone. Evolution, in other words, may have solved the problem of who keeps watch at 3 in the morning, not by giving anyone a schedule, but by making sure different people were naturally, biologically inclined to be awake at different points across the night, and then rewarding the groups whose members happened to cover the most hours. There is another layer to the social sleep hypothesis that deserves attention, because it involves a discovery that surprised even the researchers who found it. And it concerns something most of us have never thought to ask about: whether human sleep is synchronized, even now, to the phases of the moon. A study led by the sleep researcher Horacio de la Iglesia, examining both the Tobacom indigenous community in Argentina and, in a subsequent analysis, a broader data set including students living with regular access to electricity, found something that should not, on the surface, make any sense in a modern, artificially lit world. Sleep onset, the study found, shifted measurably and predictably across the lunar month. In the days leading up to a full moon, when the moon rises later in the evening and provides more ambient illumination deep into the early night, people in the study, even those living with electric lighting readily available, tended to fall asleep later and sleep for a shorter duration than in the days surrounding a new moon, when the sky after sunset offered comparatively little natural light. The effect was strongest, as one might predict, in the community without regular access to electricity, but it remained measurably present even among participants who had electric lighting and could, in principle, simply ignore the moon's presence in the sky entirely. The implication is subtle but important. Something in human physiology appears to retain a residual sensitivity to lunar illumination, a faint biological echo of a period in our evolutionary history when the difference between a moonlit night and a truly dark one meaningfully changed the level of danger a group faced, and therefore how much of the night could reasonably be spent in deep, vulnerable sleep versus lighter, more watchful rest. On a bright, moonlit night, predators lose some of the advantage darkness normally grants them. Visibility improves for everyone, hunter and hunted alike, and the specific nocturnal advantage that species like lions and hyenas depend on is somewhat diminished. It is not unreasonable to imagine that ancestral human groups, whether consciously or through some deeper, non-conscious physiological calibration, treated moonlit nights as marginally safer and adjusted their collective wakefulness accordingly, staying up later, socializing longer, sleeping somewhat less, simply because the risk calculus had shifted in their favor for those particular nights. This connects to something else the Hadza data revealed, a detail easy to overlook in the broader discussion of short sleep duration. increased nocturnal activity, specifically during full moon periods, a pattern documented independently of the Argentine research, but pointing towards the same underlying phenomenon. Two entirely separate hunter-gatherer populations on two different continents showing the same lunar-linked shift in sleep behavior is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. It suggests a genuinely deep, possibly ancient adaptation. A biological clock not set only by the daily rotation of the Earth relative to the Sun, but by the slower 29.5-day rhythm of the Moon's own cycle of illumination, embedded in our physiology, because, for a very long time, how much light the sky provided after dark was a matter of direct, unmediated survival relevance. Consider also what the social sleep hypothesis implies about one of the most intimate and universally practiced human sleep behaviors, the sleeping arrangement of infants and young children. Research among the Hadza and other contemporary hunter-gatherer populations documents a pattern of near-universal co-sleeping, infants and young children sleeping in direct physical contact with a parent, typically the mother, for a period extending well beyond what is common in many modern industrialized cultures, where solitary infant sleep in a separate room or crib has, for the last century or so, become the dominant recommended practice. Evolutionary sleep researchers have argued that this divergence is not a difference of preference or convenience, but a difference between an evolved ancestral norm and a historically very recent cultural departure from it. A human infant, born neurologically underdeveloped compared to almost any other primate, unable to walk, unable to cling to a caregiver's fur the way infant chimpanzees and gorillas instinctively do, unable to regulate its own body temperature efficiently, would have been, in the ancestral environment we've been describing, catastrophically vulnerable if left to sleep alone, even within the relative safety of a firelit, group-protected camp. Co-sleeping in this light is not simply a matter of parental convenience or bonding. It is arguably one more layer of the same defensive architecture. Fire at the perimeter, a large watchful group around it, and, at the very center of that protective structure, infants kept in the most physically secure position available, pressed directly against the body of an adult who would, by simple biological instinct, wake at the faintest sign of distress or danger. And there is a final, striking piece of comparative data worth including here, because it reframes the entire conversation about modern sleep difficulty. Insomnia, chronic difficulty falling or staying asleep, affects, by various estimates, somewhere between 10 and 30% of adults in modern industrialized societies, depending on the population studied and the diagnostic criteria applied. Among the hunter-gatherer populations studied by sleep researchers, groups living without electricity, without artificial light, without the screens and schedules and chronic stress patterns that characterize much of modern life, the reported prevalence of insomnia is dramatically lower, estimated at around 2%. This gap is worth sitting with. It suggests that the sleep difficulties so many people in the modern world experience as an ordinary, almost expected part of adult life may not be an inevitable feature of human biology at all, but rather a consequence of having removed ourselves so thoroughly from the specific environmental and social conditions our sleep architecture actually evolved to expect. Darkness that arrives on a predictable daily schedule, a firelit and socially populated transition into rest, and the deep, evolutionarily embedded reassurance of not being alone when the vulnerable hours of the night finally arrive. The evidence for the danger this vigilance was protecting against continues to surface in the archaeological record, and it keeps painting the same picture. A landscape genuinely saturated with lethal threats after dark. Cave hyenas, whose fossils are found throughout Eurasia dating primarily to the last glacial period, dominated the carnivore hierarchy of what has come to be called the Mammoth Steppe. The vast, cold, grass-dominated ecosystem that stretched across much of northern Eurasia during the Ice Ages. Home to woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and the human populations that lived alongside them. Isotopic analysis of ancient hyena bones suggests these animals, hunting cooperatively in packs much like their modern spotted hyena relatives, may have been able to competitively exclude even cave lions from access to the largest prey animals, meaning that in certain regions, at certain times, the hyena, not the lion, held the position of dominant apex predator, and human remains bearing hyena bite marks have been recovered from multiple sites across the ancient world, from Zhoukoudian in China to Atapuerca in Spain. A scattered but consistent record confirming that this predation was not an isolated incident, but a persistent, recurring feature of hominin existence across an enormous span of both time and geography. We tend to imagine our ancestors as hunters, and they were. But the fossil and archaeological record makes clear that, for an enormous stretch of our evolutionary history, we existed in a genuinely reciprocal predator-prey relationship with the large carnivores around us. Sometimes we were the hunter, and sometimes, particularly after the sun went down and our biological disadvantages in darkness became most acute, we were unambiguously the prey. Against this backdrop, the invention of fire and the evolution of a socially coordinated group vigilance sleep strategy were not minor lifestyle adjustments. They were, in the most literal biological sense, survival technologies, every bit as consequential to the continuation of our lineage as the invention of the spear or the discovery of how to make stone tools with a sharpened cutting edge. And once these two protections were reasonably well established, a fire that pushed back the darkness, and a social sleeping arrangement that distributed vigilance across a group, something new became possible for the first time in the deep history of our genus. The night stopped being purely a period of danger to be endured and survived. It began, slowly, tentatively, to become something else. A space for culture. We've already touched on the storytelling that flourished specifically after dark in the light of the fire. But there's another dimension to nighttime human activity that deserves its own careful attention, because it may represent one of the most consequential developments in the entire history of human cognition. And it happened, almost certainly, because our ancestors were looking up. Consider what the night sky actually offered a Pleistocene human being who had nothing to do but sit by the fire, and once the immediate business of eating and talking had wound down, simply look up into the darkness above, in an environment free of light pollution, which is to say, in every environment on Earth prior to the last century or two, the night sky was not the faint, washed-out scattering of a few dozen visible stars that most modern city dwellers are familiar with. It was densely, overwhelmingly populated. Thousands of individually visible stars. The pale, luminous band of the Milky Way stretched directly overhead on clear nights, planets moving with slow, patient, trackable regularity against the fixed background of more distant stars. Meteors streaking unpredictably across the field of view, the moon cycling through its predictable phases roughly every 29.5 days. This was, in effect, the single most complex, information-rich, and endlessly available natural phenomenon accessible to observation by anyone with functioning eyes and enough free time after dark to simply look. And unlike almost everything else in the immediate environment, plants that needed to be identified and gathered, animals that needed to be tracked and hunted, tools that needed to be shaped, the night sky demanded nothing practical of the observer. It could simply be watched, wondered about, discussed. Archaeological evidence for the depth of this engagement stretches back further than many people assume. Notched bones and markings found at sites across Africa and Europe, some tens of thousands of years old, have been interpreted by some researchers, though the interpretation remains genuinely debated within the field, as potential early lunar calendars, systematic records tracking the phases of the moon across successive months. Whether or not any specific artifact represents a deliberate calendar in the way we would recognize one today, the broader pattern is not seriously contested. Human beings, once they had the safety and the leisure time that fire and social sleeping arrangements provided, began systematically observing, tracking, and almost certainly discussing the patterns of the night sky, developing an intimate familiarity with celestial cycles that would eventually underpin agricultural calendars, seasonal migration timing, and navigation across open water and featureless terrain alike. There is something worth pausing on here, a connection that is easy to miss if you move through this material too quickly. The specific cognitive skill required to track the moon's 29.5-day cycle, to notice that certain stars rise and set at predictable points on the horizon depending on the season, to hold in memory a pattern that unfolds not over minutes or hours, but over weeks and months. This is fundamentally the same category of abstract, symbolic, long timescale thinking that underlies mathematics, that underlies planning for a harvest months in advance, that underlies the entire conceptual architecture of what we call civilization. It is entirely plausible, and a meaningful number of researchers in cognitive archaeology take this possibility seriously, that some of humanity's earliest sustained exercises in abstract pattern recognition happened not during the practical, task-saturated hours of daylight, but during the quiet, contemplative, socially protected hours after dark, when a group of people sitting around a fire had nothing more urgent to do than look up and start asking each other what exactly they were looking at. The night, in other words, may not simply have been survived. It may have functioned as one of the original engines of abstract human thought, a recurring nightly invitation to wonder, delivered to a species that had, for the first time in its evolutionary history, finally acquired enough safety to accept the invitation. And this brings us to something that deserves to be stated plainly, because it reframes almost everything we've discussed so far. The transition we've been tracing from a beleaguered, night-vulnerable primate hiding from predators in the dark to a species using fire and coordinated social sleep to carve out islands of safety after sunset, to a species using those newly won hours of safe darkness to tell stories, build social bonds, and stare up at the stars. This transition did not happen once and then finish. It did not happen at a single site, on a single night, to a single triumphant breakthrough generation. It happened slowly, unevenly, across hundreds of thousands of years, across multiple hominin species, in fits and starts, with plenty of nights along the way that ended not in storytelling around a fire, but in tragedy, in a hyena's jaws closing around a bone, in a cave, lion's claws finding their mark before a spear could be thrown. We are, all of us, the descendants of the individuals in every one of those camps who survived the night. Not the ones who were fastest, necessarily, or strongest, or even the cleverest in any single decisive moment. The ones who were part of a group large enough, watchful enough, and, crucially, cooperative enough that the collective vigilance of 15 or 20 people, sleeping in staggered shifts around a fire, was, on any given dangerous night, just barely sufficient to get everyone to morning. This is, when you actually sit with it, a genuinely strange thing to carry inside yourself without ever really noticing it. The uneasy, slightly irrational discomfort you feel walking into a dark room and instinctively reaching for a light switch, before you've consciously thought about why. The specific, universal, cross-cultural comfort that the sight and sound and smell of a fire seems to provide, completely independent of the actual temperature of the room, sit almost any human being down in front of a fireplace or even a video of a crackling campfire, and something in their physiology visibly relaxes. Something that has nothing to do with conscious appreciation of aesthetics, and everything to do with an ancient, deeply buried recognition that fire meant safety. The specific pleasure so many people take in being told stories after dark, in the particular ritual of gathering, quieting down, and listening. A pleasure that persists stubbornly into an age of streaming television and audiobooks. And, yes, into the exact kind of long-form spoken narrative you are listening to right at this moment. Quite possibly with the lights dimmed, quite possibly as you're preparing for sleep. None of this is coincidence. None of this is arbitrary cultural preference, invented recently and then passed down through a few generations of habit. This is the residue of 100,000 years spent solving, night after night, the single most consequential survival problem our species ever faced, and solving it not with claws or speed or size, but with fire, with cooperation, with stories, and with the simple, radical decision to face the darkness together rather than alone. There is one more thread worth following before we come to rest, because it concerns not just what our ancestors thought about at night, but what they made, deliberately, carefully, by firelight, for reasons that were almost certainly not practical in any immediate survival sense. At Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa, researchers recovered fragments of ochre, a reddish iron oxide pigment, bearing deliberately engraved geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines carved with obvious intention, dated to approximately 73,000 years ago. Alongside the engraved ochre, the same site has yielded a kind of primitive paint mixing kit. Abalone shells used as containers, ochre ground into powder and combined with binding agents. Evidence of a deliberate, planned process for producing pigment that served no function in hunting, in tool making, in any of the practical tasks that dominated daylight activity. Ochre production and use across multiple Middle Stone Age African sites appears to intensify specifically in contexts associated with symbolic behavior, body decoration, possibly the earliest forms of what we would recognize as art or ritual marking. We cannot know with certainty when, during the day or night, any specific piece of ochre was ground and applied. But we can reasonably infer the conditions under which the more elaborate examples of Ice Age symbolic and artistic behavior were created. Because in several remarkable cases, the physical evidence tells us directly. The painted cave galleries at Chauvet in France, created by human hands roughly 36,000 years ago, depicting horses, lions, rhinoceroses, and other animals with a sophistication of technique that startled researchers when the site was discovered in 1994, lie deep within a cave system, in chambers that receive no natural daylight whatsoever. Every single image on those walls was created and could only ever have been viewed by the flickering, moving light of carried flame. A torch, a stone lamp burning animal fat, some portable firelit source held by the artist or by companions standing nearby. Charred wood fragments recovered from the cave floor, along with smudge marks on the walls, consistent with torches being tapped against stone to knock off burnt residue and refresh the flame, confirm this directly. The art was not created in daylight and later viewed by torchlight as an afterthought. It was conceived, executed, and experienced entirely within the domain of artificial, carried fire, meaning, functionally, within the same technological and temporal space we have been describing throughout this entire film. The extended, fire-lit hours that fire had carved out of what would otherwise have been dead, unusable darkness. There is something worth pausing on in the fact that when our ancestors finally had the safety, the time, and the tools to create some of the most sophisticated visual art in the deep human past, they chose, or perhaps were simply constrained by circumstance, to do it by firelight, deep in the protective darkness of a cave, in a setting about as far removed from ordinary daytime life as it was possible to get. The flickering, inconsistent illumination of a torch or an oil lamp does something to painted images that steady daylight does not. It makes them move, shifting light across a curved cave wall in the presence of pigment applied to follow and exploit the natural contours of the rock, can make a painted animal appear to shift its weight, to flex a muscle, to seem, for a fraction of a second, genuinely alive. Some researchers studying Paleolithic cave art have argued this effect was not accidental, that Ice Age artists understood and deliberately exploited the specific visual properties of firelight, using the very instability of their only available light source as a tool of the artwork itself, something a painting made and viewed in steady daylight could never achieve. And death, too, seems to have taken on a particular character in the darkness. Several Neanderthal and early Homo sapiens burial sites show evidence suggesting that interment, the deliberate placement of a body into a prepared grave, may often have occurred at specific, ritually significant times, though the precise timing within a day-night cycle is difficult to establish archaeologically with full confidence. What is better established is the broader pattern. Grave goods, deliberate body positioning, the use of ochre pigment scattered or applied directly to the deceased, all appearing at multiple sites across tens of thousands of years, indicating that death was marked, deliberately and repeatedly, with behavior that carried no plausible practical or survival function. It was symbolic. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, cultural. And it emerged from a species that had, by this point, spent hundreds of thousands of years developing an increasingly sophisticated relationship with the specific hours after sunset, hours that had once meant nothing but danger, and had gradually become, through fire, through cooperative vigilance, through accumulated social trust, a space in which grief itself could be given shape and meaning. The moon, too, appears repeatedly across human mythology in ways that are difficult to explain except as a residue of this deep observational history. Lunar deities and lunar-associated myths appear independently across an enormous range of unconnected human cultures, societies with no plausible historical contact with one another, nonetheless converging, again and again, on stories that treat the moon as a marker of time, of fertility, of death and rebirth, of the passage between one state of being and another. This kind of convergent, independently invented mythology is exactly what we would expect. If the moon's cycle had functioned for an enormous span of human prehistory, as one of the very few reliable, universally observable, slow timescale patterns available to a species that had only just begun developing the cognitive tools to track and think about extended cycles of time at all. Before agriculture gave humans seasonal planting calendars, before written language allowed the recording of long-term astronomical observation, the moon was already there, every single night, changing shape in a pattern so consistent and so slow that noticing it, tracking it, and eventually building stories and rituals around it may represent one of the very first sustained intellectual projects our species ever undertook, conducted, appropriately enough, entirely at night, by firelight, by people who had finally won enough safety from the darkness to have the mental space left over to wonder about it. There is a final turn this story needs to take, because everything we've described so far, the fire, the social sleep, the storytelling, The art, made deep in caves by torchlight, was built around one consistent, unchanging fact. Darkness, real darkness, arrived every single night, on schedule, and stayed until dawn. That fact held true for essentially the entire span of human existence. It stopped being true only extremely recently, and the consequences of that change are only now beginning to be properly understood, and they are not what most people would predict. In 1879, Thomas Edison successfully demonstrated a long-lasting incandescent light bulb, and within a few decades, electric lighting began spreading through cities across the industrialized world. This is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most consequential technological shifts in the entire history of our species, arguably more consequential in terms of its effect on daily human behavior than almost anything that preceded it. And yet it happened, from an evolutionary perspective, essentially yesterday. If the roughly 300,000 years of Homo sapiens' existence were compressed into a single 24-hour day, widespread electric lighting would have arrived in the final 100th of a second before midnight. Every single adaptation we've discussed in this film, the fire-seeking comfort response, the amygdala's calibrated nighttime fear, the social sleep architecture distributing vigilance across a group, the lunar-linked shifts in sleep timing, the entire deep biological relationship between human beings and darkness, evolved across hundreds of thousands of years in an environment that electric light has now fundamentally altered in the space of little more than a century. The consequences are measurable and they are substantial. Researchers studying what is now commonly called light pollution, the pervasive artificial illumination of the night sky by streetlights, buildings, vehicles, and countless other sources, estimate that more than 80% of the world's population now lives under skies too bright to see the Milky Way with the naked eye. In much of North America and Western Europe, that figure climbs even higher. An entire, direct, nightly experience that shaped human mythology, human timekeeping, and quite possibly human abstract thought itself across hundreds of thousands of years has, for the majority of people alive today, simply vanished. Most people currently living on Earth will go their entire lives without ever seeing the night sky the way every single one of their ancestors saw it, every clear night, for the overwhelming majority of human history. And the loss is not merely aesthetic. The human circadian rhythm, the internal biological clock that regulates sleep timing, hormone release, body temperature, and a wide range of other physiological processes on a roughly 24-hour cycle, is calibrated primarily by light exposure, and specifically by the contrast between bright daytime light and genuinely dark nighttime conditions. Artificial light in the evening hours, particularly light rich in the blue wavelengths emitted by many electronic screens and much modern LED lighting, has been shown repeatedly in sleep research to suppress the release of melatonin, the hormone that signals to the body that it is time to prepare for sleep. A landmark study published by researchers at Harvard Medical School found that exposure to blue-enriched light in the hours before bed delayed melatonin release by an average of approximately 3 hours compared to exposure to dimmer, warmer light, a shift substantial enough to meaningfully alter not just when people fall asleep, but the underlying timing of their entire internal biological clock. This matters because it connects directly back to everything we discussed earlier about the evolved, socially embedded architecture of human sleep. Our ancestors' sleep was never simply a matter of individual biology operating in isolation. It was a coordinated, socially staggered, environmentally synchronized system, tied to the actual rhythm of a genuinely dark night, and calibrated by hundreds of thousands of years of exposure to real, unmediated darkness punctuated only by firelight and moonlight. Modern artificial lighting does not simply let us stay awake later by choice. It actively interferes with the biological machinery that evolved specifically to read darkness as a signal, disrupting a system that had remained essentially unchanged for the vast majority of the time our species has existed, in the span of what amounts to a few short generations. The public health consequences of this disruption are increasingly well documented, though researchers are still working to fully untangle cause from correlation. Rates of diagnosed sleep disorders in industrialized nations have risen substantially over the past several decades, tracking closely alongside the expansion of always available artificial lighting and, more recently, the near-universal adoption of light-emitting screens used deep into the evening hours. Chronic sleep disruption has been linked, across a substantial body of research, to elevated risks of cardiovascular disease, metabolic disorders including type 2 diabetes, impaired immune function, and measurable declines in cognitive performance. Outcomes that researchers increasingly frame not as a collection of unrelated modern ailments, but as the downstream consequences of a single underlying mismatch. A nervous system built by evolution to expect real darkness, operating instead in an environment that almost never provides it. There is a particular irony worth sitting with here, one that brings this entire story full circle. For the overwhelming majority of human history, our central nighttime problem was too much darkness. A world in which the absence of light left us dangerously exposed to predators far better equipped than we were to exploit it. Fire was the technology that solved that problem, carving safe islands of light out of an otherwise threatening darkness, and in doing so, gave our species the protected hours it needed to develop language, storytelling, art, and abstract thought. Now, for a rapidly growing proportion of humanity, the problem has inverted almost completely. We no longer struggle against too much darkness. We struggle against too much light, an environment so persistently, artificially illuminated that many of us have functionally forgotten what our ancestors' nervous systems were built to expect, and are only now beginning to understand what we lose, biologically and psychologically, when we never truly experience it. Some researchers studying this shift have begun deliberately testing what happens when modern people are temporarily returned to something closer to ancestral darkness conditions. In one frequently cited study, a group of participants was taken camping for a week with no access to artificial light sources of any kind. No phone screens, no flashlights beyond what was strictly necessary. Nothing but natural daylight and firelight after dark. Within just a few days, researchers measured a significant shift in the timing of participants' natural melatonin release, moving earlier and aligning more closely with actual sunset, alongside self-reported improvements in sleep quality and a marked reduction in the kind of pre-sleep wakefulness so common in modern life. The human circadian system, it turns out, has not been permanently altered by a century of artificial light. It has simply been overridden temporarily by an environmental signal so persistent and so recent that most of us have never known anything else, and it appears capable, given the chance, of remembering with remarkable speed exactly what it originally evolved to do. This is, in a strange and quietly moving way, the final piece of the story we've been telling. The night that once threatened to kill our ancestors, and that they gradually, painstakingly learned to survive, and then to inhabit with fire and cooperation and story, has not disappeared. It has simply retreated, pushed back by our own success at eliminating it, until many of us now live our entire lives having never truly met it. And yet, the parts of us built to face that night, the wary attention to unexplained sound, the specific comfort of firelight, the pull towards stories told after the lights go down, the biological clock still quietly listening for a darkness it rarely gets to fully experience. Those parts remain, patient and largely unchanged, waiting, in effect, for a night that most of us have engineered almost entirely out of our lives. The lions are gone now, at least from the parts of the world most of you listening to this are likely to live in. The hyenas that once left their bite marks on hominin bone have, in most regions, long since retreated to the shrinking wild spaces we haven't yet paved over. You are, statistically, safer at night right now than any human being has ever been at any previous point in the history of our species. Safer than your grandparents were. Safer than anyone who lived before the invention of the electric light. Safer, by an almost unimaginable margin, than the small group of Homo sapiens huddled around a fire in Pleistocene Africa 100,000 years ago, straining to hear whether that sound in the darkness beyond the firelight was simply the wind or something considerably more interested in them. And yet, the fear remains, encoded, patient, entirely indifferent to how thoroughly modern engineering and urban infrastructure have actually solved the problem it evolved to respond to. Your amygdala does not read population statistics on predator extinction. It does not know that the leopard that once specifically targeted human ancestors, leaving its distinctive bite pattern on hominin skulls, recovered from African sites, has no modern equivalent stalking your neighborhood tonight. It simply does what it has always done, running the same ancient calculation it has run for every human being who ever lived, in every dark room, on every unfamiliar night. Something moved, something made a sound, and until we know otherwise, we should probably be afraid. That fear is not a flaw in your design. It is not something to be embarrassed about, or something modern rationality has somehow failed to fully overwrite. It is an inheritance, arguably one of the oldest, most continuously useful inheritances your body carries, older than language, older than agriculture, very possibly older than our species itself in something close to its current form. It kept enough of your ancestors alive on enough dangerous nights, across enough hundreds of thousands of years, that you exist to feel it at all. So the next time you find yourself lying awake in the dark, listening a little too closely to an unfamiliar sound in another room, or feeling that small, specific comfort settle over you as you watch flames move in a fireplace, or noticing how naturally your attention drifts toward a story once the lights go down and the day's obligations finally fall silent, understand what you're actually experiencing. You are not being irrational. You are not imagining things. You are doing exactly what a very long, very successful line of ancestors did before you, stretching back across more nights than any of us can meaningfully picture, paying close attention to the dark, and trusting, as they did, that morning would eventually come.